It stares at you with a gaze that is at once terrified and terrifying. The eyes are not the soulful, upturned windows to the divine that we expect from religious iconography. They are dark, undefined voids, asymmetrical and swimming in a pool of flat, beige flesh. Where there should be the delicate, shadowed hollow of a cheekbone, there is instead a swollen, bulbous curve that defies anatomy. The mouth, intended to be a soft grimace of pious suffering, has been smeared into a shapeless, dark smudge that drifts uncomfortably towards the chin. This is not the Christ of the Renaissance, nor the suffering martyr of the Baroque. This is something else entirely. This is the face that broke the world in the sweltering August of 2012. When we look at the image that came to be known as Ecce Mono, or Behold the Monkey, we are confronted with a visual disruption so severe that it feels violent. To understand the magnitude of this disruption, we must first look at what was lost. Elías García Martínez's original 1930s fresco was not a masterpiece of innovation, but it was a competent, dignified piece of academic art. It followed the rules. The original Christ looked upward, his expression one of stoic acceptance. The brushwork was controlled, utilizing the traditional chiaroscuro techniques to render the volume of the nose, the depth of the eye sockets, and the sharp, painful texture of the crown of thorns. It was a painting that whispered its devotion, blending seamlessly into the quiet, dusty atmosphere of the Sanctuary of Mercy in Borja. But the image that replaced it screams. The restoration effectively annihilated the illusion of three-dimensional space. The subtle gradations of skin tone were replaced by thick, opaque layers of paint that sit heavily on the surface of the wall. The crown of thorns, a crucial symbol of the Passion, was reduced to a fuzzy, indistinct halo that looks more like a fur hood than a wreath of cane, hence the monkey moniker. The neck disappears into the tunic without the structural integrity of a clavicle or a throat. It is a collapse of form. However, if we strip away the initial layer of ridicule that swept across the internet like a tidal wave, there is a raw, chaotic energy here that is impossible to ignore. In its technical failure, the image achieves a strange, haunting power. The wide, staring eyes possess a kind of desperate intensity that the original lacked. The chaotic brushstrokes, while unskilled, vibrate with a frantic urgency. It is a face stripped of its mask of academic perfection, revealing something crude, primal, and deeply unsettling. We are forced to ask, why does this ruined face hold our attention so much more tightly than the correct one ever did? The original was a window we looked through. The restoration is a wall we crash against. It forces a reaction. It demands an opinion. In the canon of art history, we often praise the deconstruction of form. Think of Francis Bacon's distorted portraits or the aggressive primitivism of Basquiat. While this restoration lacks their intentionality, it shares their visual language of distortion. It is a jarring subversion of expectation, a visual glitch in the matrix of traditional religious art that, in its sheer abruptness, became the most recognizable image of the year. Now, let us turn our gaze from the canvas to the hand that held the brush. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to view this event through the lens of vandalism, to imagine a reckless ego imposing itself on history. But the reality of Borja is far more tender and far more tragic. The hand did not belong to a vandal, but to Cecilia Giménez, an octogenarian parishioner whose life was woven into the very stone of the Sanctuary of Mercy. She was not an enemy of art. She was its self-appointed guardian, working in the solitary quiet of a church that the world had largely forgotten. Imagine the scene. The year is 2012. The fresco is dying. Decades of moisture rising from the earth are eating away at the plaster, causing Martínez's Christ to flake and fade into oblivion. This is the cruelty of entropy. Art, like flesh, is mortal. Giménez sees this decay not as a chemical process, but as a spiritual wound. She watches the face of her savior vanishing day by day. She waits for professional conservators who do not come, for funding that does not exist. And so, armed with the profound, terrifying courage of the devout, she decides to intervene. This context transforms the botched restoration into a poignant artifact of human frailty. Giménez was not trying to create a new work. She was desperately trying to hold on to the old one. The thick, clumsy layers of paint were not an attack, but a bandage. She was applying a salve to a dying friend. When we look at the heavy-handed application of the tunic or the flattening of the facial features, we are seeing the panic of preservation. We are seeing a race against time fought by someone without the weapons to win it. There is a concept in art history known as art brut, or raw art created outside the boundaries of official culture by those untrained in the academic tradition. These works are prized for their directness, their lack of filter, and their emotional transparency. Giménez's work, inadvertently, falls into this category. It is naive art in its purest form. It bypasses the intellect and the rules of perspective to arrive at a raw expression of care. The distortion of the face mirrors the distortion of her own anxiety. The wide, panicked eyes of the Christ figure perhaps reflect the wide, panicked realization of the artist as the paint refused to behave as she intended. This recontextualization asks us a difficult question. Does the value of art lie solely in the final execution, or can it be found in the intention? If we judge the fresco by the standards of the Academy, it is a disaster. But if we judge it as a physical manifestation of devotion, a grandmother's desperate attempt to save a piece of her community's soul, it gains a tragic beauty. It becomes a monument to the limitations of human effort. We strive for the divine, for perfection, for immortality, and yet our hands shake, our eyes fail, and we are left with something broken. In this way, Giménez's Ecce Homo is perhaps a more honest representation of the human condition than the polished, idealized version that sat on the wall for 80 years. It is a portrait of our own inadequacy, painted with the brush of love. In the aftermath of the Restoration, something miraculous happened, something that defies the cynical logic of the art market and the solemnity of the museum world. The laughter died down, or rather, it transmuted into something else: pilgrimage. The town of Borja, a quiet community struggling with the same economic stagnation as much of rural Spain, suddenly found itself at the center of the global map. Thousands of visitors began to arrive. They came not to mock, but to witness. The ruin became a relic. This phenomenon forces us to reevaluate Ecce Homo through the lens of pop art and contemporary social engagement. Andy Warhol taught us that the image is a commodity, that repetition and fame can bestow value upon the mundane. Cecilia Giménez, in her failure, achieved a level of ubiquity that Elías García Martínez never could. The monkeychrist was printed on wine labels, t-shirts, and coffee mugs. It was remixed into memes, inserted into famous movie scenes, and endlessly reproduced across the digital landscape. It became a piece of open-source cultural property. In this sense, Giménez inadvertently created the ultimate interactive masterpiece for the internet age. We must consider the miracle of Borja. The sanctuary, once empty, began charging a modest admission fee. The funds raised, tens of thousands of euros annually, went to fund the sanctuary's upkeep and local charities. The worst restoration in history saved the very building that housed it and supported the community that worshipped there. If the function of religious art is to gather the faithful and support the works of the church, then Giménez's fresco is arguably more successful now than it ever was as a pristine academic painting. It performed a literal miracle of economic resurrection. This brings us to the final provocative conclusion. Is it a masterpiece? If we define a masterpiece by technical proficiency, clearly not. But if we define a masterpiece by its ability to provoke emotion, to stimulate discourse, to gather people, and to change the world around it,
then the answer becomes murky. Art does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the space between the object and the viewer. The emotional and social charge that now surrounds this small patch of plaster is electric. The Ecce Homo of Borja challenges the elitism of the art world. It suggests that a failed image can hold more weight than a successful one if it strikes a nerve in the collective consciousness. It is an unintentional avant-garde manifesto, proving that in the 21st century, relevance is not dictated by critics or curators, but by the sheer, undeniable force of public attention. Cecilia Giménez destroyed a painting, yes, but in doing so, she created an icon. She gave us a face that reflects the absurdity, the humor, and the chaotic connectivity of our modern lives. It is a mirror held up to a world that loves a tragedy, only to find that the tragedy has become a triumph. In the end, the painting is no longer about Christ. It is about us, and that, in its own strange, warped way, is the mark of great art.